guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my January wrap-up. So the month of January feels like it has lasted about 12 years. I don't know why. There's something about January that just makes it feel like the absolute longest month ever. And it was apparently a really good month of reading for me because I did read 12 books this month, many of which are not physical copies. You can see my little stack of physical copies is actually not that big. So it was a really interesting month for a number of reasons. I read some amazing stuff, I read some quite disappointing stuff, and some of those disappointing things I did actually DNF. So I am going to really quickly run through some of the books that I DNF'd because in an effort to not only get through my TBR but also to achieve some of my reading goals, I have become a little bit more vicious with my DNFing, a little bit more brutal, and I did DNF some review copies. So I'm going to talk about those first, and then I'm going to go through the books that I read this month in order. Okay, so I actually have 4 books here that I did DNF, and just to rattle through them really quickly, those were A Throne of Swans by Catherine and Elizabeth Kaur. There's nothing wrong with this book, I just couldn't quite click with it. I couldn't really connect with it. YA fantasy is something that I've really been struggling with lately, and it has to be something that's like completely new and mind-blowing and kind of have crossover appeal with adult audiences for me to really be interested in at the moment, and this is a little bit on the generic side, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not what my brain wants right now. So I am going to pop this back on the shelf and keep it for a later date when I am more interested in reading this kind of fantasy. I also DNF'd Spell Hacker by M.K. England. This is another one that I am going to be picking up another time because I think that I will enjoy this if I'm in a very specific mood. At the moment, I am still getting over the trauma of Aurora Rising, and this reminded me a lot of Aurora Rising. I hated every single thing about that book. It was one of my DNFs from last year, and I hated it so much. And this reminded me of it in some ways. It's got like kind of the snappy banter and the squad and all of that stuff, the gang of misfits, and it was too similar to something that I really hated not that long ago, about 6 months ago. So I'm going to try to pick this up when I am in a better state of mind. I also decided to DNF The God Game by Danny Tobey. Nothing wrong with this book, it's just that I couldn't quite get my head into it. It just wasn't necessarily what I wanted to read. I am going to potentially give this one another try at a later date, but I'm a little bit less sure. And unfortunately, last but not least, one of my most highly anticipated books of the year. I'm really sad about this one, and I sort of agonized over whether or not to DNF it for several weeks. The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. I read about half of this book, and it's not a bad book. This is completely personal, so don't let this or any of the things that I say determine whether or not you're going to read something, because all of this is obviously my personal opinion. But have you ever had one of those books that you know you're supposed to like, but every time you put it down, everything completely goes out of your head, and you can't like connect with the characters, and there's just some kind of weird disconnect between yourself and the book? That is what I got from this one. I really, really wish I could have loved it. It's everything that I should love. It's like death cults and lesbian orcs and assassins and crazy magic and weird, weird world building. Like, I should have been all over this book, but for some reason, something with it didn't click in my head. I was talking to one of my friends about this book who felt very similar, and she made a really good point of the ingredients are all there. There's just something about it that's not working. So I'm really sad about this one. I really wanted to love it, but as I said, don't let this deter you from picking it up. If you're still interested in picking it up, like, my opinion literally means nothing in terms of what you're gonna like and what you'll want to read and everything. I really, because this is a debut, I really, really don't want to, like, you know, turn people away from it, so ignore me. So those were my DNFs, and now we're on to the books that I did read. There's a good mix here, stuff that I loved, maybe one book that I think will be on my best books of 2020 list. We'll see how the year pans out. And some mega disappointments, some things I really, really was expecting to love and just didn't. So it's a really mixed bag of ratings this time round. It's about 4.5 stars to 2 stars at the lowest. So let's get started. So the very first book that I read was Artificial Condition by Martha Wells. This is the second book in the Murderbot Diaries series of novellas, and this is the book that I was intending to finish on New Year's Eve and had like 100 pages to go and just didn't get around to it. So this was my very first book that I finished in 2020, and I really enjoyed this. I think I talked about in my December wrap-up, I read All Systems Red ages ago, probably in 2018, and I did not connect with it. It just didn't click with me. So I tried it again in physical format instead of ebook format in December, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the second one. I actually think I liked the second one even more, and I'm very excited to continue on with the series. So I'm not going to go deep into what this book is about because it is indeed a sequel, but basically this series follows in the first person a kind of security unit robot android type thing, and it has hacked its governor module and basically gained sort of sentience and free will, and all it wants to do is sit, watch, reality TV, basically the equivalent of trashy soap operas, and just have the humans leave it alone. But unfortunately it has to continue on with its job protecting humans. So this is the second book, as I say, and I think that the smart thing that she did with this one is introduce new characters. There's a particular character named Art, or A-R-T, who I just absolutely loved and I hope to see again in future books. But I think that if we just followed Murderbot over and over and over again with no other real characters being introduced, it would have gotten really stale really quickly. So I think it was really smart of her to change things up. This very much, it doesn't feel like, the second part in a novel or something, which is what I was thinking could potentially happen with this series. This is very much a book that stands by itself, although you have to have read the first one, I think, to get what's going on here. So I really enjoyed that. I actually liked this more than the first one, which I think I gave 4 stars on a reread. I gave this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read, I'm so pleased that I finally gave a chance because one of my real life friends, Jenny, loves this book and has been, I think, kind of hinting at me to read it for a really long time, and so I took her up on her suggestion and I ended up reading this in January and just loved it. Absolutely loved it. This is Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. Very different from the, I think, Blake Crouch Dark Matter. This is actually a ghost story. Dark Matter follows a character named Jack in 1937, and it's told primarily through his diary entries. So he is very much down on his luck, and he ends up sort of scoring a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to join an Arctic expedition and sort of get the chance to sort of see this incredible part of the world and sort of become an explorer, something that he's always wanted to do. So they get there, and all is well and good. They are sort of at the time of year when they arrive when they have almost complete daylight. And then of course, when we get to the Arctic in certain parts of the winter in the year, there's 24 hours of darkness. So darkness begins to descend, it starts lasting later and later, and it's obvious that something has happened at this camp, although we don't really know what. We just kind of have his suspicions. There's some strange things that are happening. And then his teammates on this expedition kind of have to drop out one by one and leave him alone in isolation, and it's very clear that something is haunting this area. I loved this. I am such a wimp when it comes to horror books and ghost stories and things like that. But there was something about this that really worked for me. It really connected and it really clicked in my brain. And I think that part of it is that it's not sort of out and out, ghosts jumping out of everywhere and dropping from the ceiling and all of that. This book is all about tension, that incredible tension, and this man kind of by himself facing the loneliness of this incredibly desolate place with no sort of sunlight whatsoever, no real breaks in the day. It's really good. I really enjoyed this. I think the only thing that kept this from being a 5-star read instead of a 4.5-star read is the ending didn't quite stick the landing. However, I do feel like with these kinds of stories, when they're really, really tense or you have some kind of, entity, you can't really wrap it up particularly well. So for any Doctor Who fans out there, it's like for me, that one episode where you see the weeping angels move and suddenly they go from this incredibly terrifying entity to just another thing because the thing that made them scary has gone away. If that makes any sense. I hope it does. To her credit though, I just don't think that there was a really perfect way to wrap this book up. I think she did a great job with what she had. As I say, gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars and would highly recommend it, even if you are not a horror reader. So the next book that I read was one of those big disappointments that I talked about. This seems to be a book that is in some ways really underrated and underhyped, but the people who love it like adore it, and the people who don't like it really don't like it, and unfortunately I fell on the latter side of that. This is A Big Ship at the Edge of the Universe by Alex White. So, I have a lot of feelings about this book. I buddy read this with my friend Amber from Books of Amber, and it wasn't great, unfortunately. It's one of those books that I feel, I don't mean to like slag off the author at all. That's not what I mean from any of this, but it does have the feeling of someone basically watching Firefly and being like, oh, that's easy, I can do that, and then writing a book. There's just no real depth. There's some originality, but it's not kind of explored well enough. I don't think the characters are super flat, and I felt really, really immature, but kind of like in the I'm a teenager and think that this is cool kind of way that you sometimes get, I think, with young adult books. And it didn't work for me. So this book follows 2 main characters. Nyla, who is sort of a international celebrity and race car star. So this book opens with a sort of sci-fi car race, which is kind of cool. But she, in the midst of one of her races, this sort of crazy incident happens and one of the other drivers dies and she ends up getting framed for his murder on the track. And we have this other character named Boots. His actual name is Elizabeth, I think, and she's a kind of washed up former soldier from the losing side of the famine war, and she is basically someone who sells shoddy treasure maps to treasure hunters. The two of them end up colliding, and they sort of get pulled into this crazy plot to find this incredibly mysterious missing warship. And the reason that I'm kind of going like this is the fact that the stakes in this book I felt were never quite... It never felt urgent to find this warship thingy. I could never really figure out why it was so important to find this warship thingy. Obviously you'd get lots of money from selling it off, but like people are literally murdering each other for it. It just didn't work for me. I couldn't understand the stakes. I couldn't understand why people were dying, why people were constantly attacking them, because they were constantly under attack. They were always being chased in all of this. And the characters were just so, for me, bland. I actually quite liked Boots. I like the older, sort of foul-mouthed, washed-up soldier type. And I thought Nyla had a really interesting character arc, going from a super mega privileged brat to sort of becoming more of a well-rounded person. But unfortunately, you have this other cast of characters. You have a whole bunch of other people in this kind of ragtag crew of misfits, and they just... I can't remember most of their names. I can't remember what they do. I can't remember their personalities. I just remember that they're super, like, attempting banter, and it doesn't really work. And they are so like all over the place in the emotional spectrum. They just didn't act like people to me, and I couldn't believe in any of them, and I just was bored of them. So that's not great. I also wasn't a huge fan of kind of the story and how things played out. This book was just a huge miss for me. I'm reining myself in because I have a lot that I could just rant and yell about. I was really hoping to love it because Nicholas Eames blurbed it on the front and on the back. It looked like a super fun adventure. I love this cover. We all know that I'm super shallow. And it was dumb. It made me really angry, and it still makes me really angry. So I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. It would have been lower, but I did really like Boots as a character. I thought she was really interesting. I liked the magic system of there being magic in a sci-fi setting. That was quite cool. It wasn't explored nearly enough for my personal preference. And I don't know, it just had a lot of missed potential, and I'm really mad at this book. The next book that I read was one of my favorites of the year, I think, and I'm really glad that I read this after such a disappointing book, because the joy that this one brought me just made me so incredibly happy. So this is The Unlikely Escape of Uriah Heep by H.G. Perry. I've done a full review of this book, and I'll go ahead and link that either down below or somewhere up here. It'll be linked somewhere. I'm still figuring this thing out. And it was an absolute delight to read. I really, really loved it. So The Unlikely Escape of Uriah Heep, in short, follows 2 brothers, one of whom is Rob, and he's a very kind of normal, ordinary guy. He likes his life that way. He's a lawyer, he has a wife, the white picket fence, everything. And he does have a little bit of a secret, or his family has a bit of a secret, because his younger brother, Charlie, is a summoner. Basically, he can pull characters out of books. And this causes all kinds of mayhem, because of course, Charlie is a Victorianist, and the Victorians had some very colorful characters and very colorful villains. So when the book opens, they are basically, Charlie calls Rob at like 2 o'clock in the morning. He's like, "Help, I brought Uriah Heep out of David Copperfield, help me put him back." And he's like wrestling with this fictional character, and they're trying to like basically shove him back in his book. It was so fun. It was a great opening. So Rob doesn't really love this about his brother. He would much rather he be ordinary, stop using his power, all of this. However, they have to team up together and find the other summoner who is in Wellington, who is bringing characters out of books for nefarious reasons. There's a whole colorful cast of characters in this book, everyone from Uriah Heep to Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights. You get the White Witch from the Chronicles of Narnia. It's so fun. There are 5 Darcys, and it's just a wonderful, hilarious, fun book, but it's also really heartfelt, and it's all about the complexities of familial relationships, especially between siblings. I loved it. I loved it so much. You can go ahead and check out their review for more, but I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. I think this may be one of my favorite books of the year. After that, I listened to Grimm Tales for the Young and Old by Philip Pullman. This is basically just a collection of Grimm fairy tales in their sort of original gory form, collected by Philip Pullman, and it was narrated by someone else, a great narrator actually. I would highly recommend the audiobook for this. I picked this up in an airport ages ago, I think it maybe like 2017, and the audiobook was an Audible daily deal, so it was like £1.99, so I ended up picking it up, listening to it, and it was just an absolute delight. It's a great audiobook to kind of dip in and out of because it is a collection of fairy tales. There are some very, very, very short ones, and there are some much longer ones as well. I don't have a huge number of thoughts on this one because it is just a fairy tale collection. However, I thought that it was an interesting collection of really well-known stories versus ones I'd never heard of before, and it was just a delight to listen to. So I would highly recommend this. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read 2 books by the same author, and these are the 3rd and 4th installments in a series. This is Thornbound and Moontangled by Stephanie Burgess. I'll just leave the cover of Moontangled up here because that one is coming out very, very soon. So I was offered a review copy of this book by Stephanie, and I really needed to catch up with the series, so I read Thornbound just before then. And these books, if you haven't tried them out, they're just an absolute delight. They are wonderful. They're like super cozy, Regency, alternate Regency fantasy romance. And they are just light and fun and delightful and bantery and just like, they're so good. So Thornbound is the longer of these two books. There are two basically novellas and two sort of short novels in this series. Thornbound is a short novel and it follows Cassandra Harwood as she is opening her school of magic for young women in England, which is the alternate version of England. And basically in this world, there are very, very rigid gender roles, which may be surprising when you learn that women are politicians. They are considered the more kind of level-headed and rational of the two sexes, and we have gentlemen who are magicians because they are considered more emotional and sort of fanciful. And these gender roles are very, very rigid and defined until Cassandra Harwood basically comes kicking that door down and becomes the first lady magician in England. So in this book, she is opening up a school for young women who would also like to be magicians. So in Tangled, we follow two characters who are very much kind of in the background and they get their full sort of story. And if you are a fan of the series, you may squeak like I did when I learned who this was about. This is the story of Caroline and Juliana, the secret fiancés. So good. So basically in this political system, young women who are hoping to become politicians basically have to marry a magician. And at this point, all magicians have been male. However, Caroline and Juliana have been in love and are secretly engaged. And when Juliana becomes a full-fledged magician, they can come out with their relationship, and if all goes well, marry, and everything will be totally fine and happy. And oh, I loved this story so much. It made me so happy. It was the perfect, like, light fantasy to see me through a bleak Saturday afternoon. I love these books so much. They're so good, and they're just wonderful reads. If you are interested in audiobooks, Emma Newman, who's one of my favorite authors, does the narration for them and is just fantastic, but reading the actual like physical edition of these books is also just as much fun. So I gave Thornbound 4 out of 5 stars and Tangled 4.5 out of 5. Next up, I read The Deep by River Solomon with David Diggs, William Hudson, and Jonathan Snipes. This is a novella that was inspired by a song of the same title, which I actually haven't listened to. I had no idea that it existed before I ended up receiving a copy of this novella for review. So I think one of them's one of the original cast members from Hamilton, so that's very exciting. I haven't seen Hamilton, but I know that this was a very, very hyped up book for a lot of people, and I am so happy that I read it. This story follows Yetu, who is a historian for her people, and her people are the Wajinru, who are the descendants of the unborn babies of African women who were captured as slaves and thrown overboard during the Atlantic slave trade because they were viewed as a drain on resources. So these babies survived and they sort of evolved into these air and water breathing, basically mermaids, and they live in the depths of the ocean. Because their history is so full of pain and heartbreak, the Wajinru essentially select one person to hold the collective memories of their ancestors, and this person is called the historian. So Yetu is the historian, and she basically carries the shared history of all of her people as true memories, and once a year they have this ceremony called the Remembering, and she sort of transmits these memories to her people. Holding the collective memories of her people and her ancestors really takes its toll on Yetu. So she ends up fleeing one day, and she has to kind of reflect on her role within her society and whether or not it is actually destroying her as a person and her identity. I think that the writing in this book will divide some people. I thought it was absolutely beautiful, but it is not the most straightforward. It is not the most easy reading. It's a little bit more dense, but I thought it was absolutely stunning. It's basically poetic all the way through. I really also enjoyed the kind of world building and the building of this culture of the Wajunru, and the way that Solomon explores things like gender identity and sexuality through these people. And just the shared history of the Atlantic slave trade is so incredibly devastating. I am obviously not an Own Voices reviewer for this book. However, you can go ahead and check out my blog review, which is linked down below, where I do link some other reviews from Own Voices reviewers, because this is not my story to tell. I'm really, really happy that I read it, and I really, really enjoyed it. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, but I think that there are other people out there who will better be able to tell you what they thought and the impact of this book. I hope that all makes sense. The next book that I read is kind of a funny one, because I really enjoyed it. It was really good fun, but it's definitely not the most original fantasy that I've read, and you guys probably know by now that I really enjoy a very unique fantasy book. But I still just read the hell out of this book. It is a thumping good read, as my mother would say. This is A Queen in Hiding by Sarah Kozloff. So the main focus of the marketing for this book is the fact that it is going to be a super binge-worthy series, because all 4 books come out within 4 months. So this book just came out in January, the next one will come out in February, then March, then April. So you don't have to wait 4 years for this series to be done. You can finish it in 4 months, which is actually really awesome. And I have to say, given the pace of the writing and the kind of excitement of the story, I do think that this is definitely a binge-worthy series. So in the kind of big sprawling narrative, because this is a truly epic narrative in that it covers years, I think this book covers 12 years, and that's just the first book. We follow a character named Cressa, who is the queen of her people, and Cressa's daughter, whose name is Cerulia. And at the beginning of the book, Cerulia is about 6 or 7 years old, and there is a sort of coup to take over the throne, and the two of them have to flee. They end up separating. Cressa drops Cerulia off somewhere to hide and goes off to try to regain her throne. And I have a feeling that this is going to be a mad series. I have a feeling that so much is going to happen, because, as I say, so much is packed into this book. It literally does, I think, cover 12 years, if not a little bit more, which is mad. I really enjoyed the story. Just judging from what I read on the back of this book, which is a proof, so I don't know if this is like the final copy or what, but I did think that this book would be more about Cerulia, the daughter. However, I think it's much more about Cressa, the mother, and I really loved her as a character. She was just amazing, especially in the way that she is sort of living in her own mother's shadow, because her mother was known to be a great strategist, and she is seen as more of a weak queen. So she really has to kind of come into her own, and that really only happens after she loses her throne. So I really enjoyed her story. I was a little bit less interested in Cerulia herself, because she is so young for most of it, but I have a feeling that in the next book it's going to really kick off for her story. This is like a truly epic story. It's got like the good queens, the spunky daughter, it's got, you know, the mustache twirling baddie, it's got magic, it's got, you know, all this incredible sort of culture and world building. There's a whole thing about hair color being incredibly important. So the queens of this particular country literally have blue hair, and that's how you can identify the royals. And it was really, really fun. Will it be groundbreaking and innovative? No, not necessarily. Do I think that it was necessarily the best written? Maybe not. It does really struggle with that incredible passing of time. You have to pick up on a lot of context clues and be like, oh, 5 years has gone by. So I think that there are a lot of ways that this could have been improved, but it was a really fun read, and I am planning on continuing this series. I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I have another debut novel. I read a lot of debuts this month. This is The Last Smile in Sunder City by Luke Arnold. And the name Luke Arnold may be familiar. I was not familiar with any of his work as an actor. However, he is on Black Sails, I believe. And this is his very first novel. And although not familiar with him as an actor at all, was a little bit dubious at first because the last book that I read by a celebrity, by an actor, was Bonfire by Kristen Ritter, which was pretty atrocious. So I had kind of some shady expectations for this book, but I ended up really enjoying it. It is a really fun read, and he's just a great writer. So this book follows a character named Fetch Phillips, and he lives in Sunder City. He is a man for hire, essentially acting as a private detective in this book. And this book takes place after the Coda, which is basically the event in which all magic in the world died. And this happened 6 years ago. We know that humans had something to do with it. We know that maybe Fetch had something to do with it. And we really see the after effects of magic leaving the world and basically destroying all of these magical creatures and throwing the world back into a pre-technological age because so much technology ran on magic. I loved the world building in this book. It was such a fantastic idea, and he does an amazing job of showing you how bleak the world has become and how these effects are impacting the magical creatures, because humans are the only ones who don't have magic, so really physiologically they're not affected at all. However, you have vampires who are basically crumbling and turning to dust. Their fangs are falling out. You have banshees that have lost their voices. You have siren families being ripped apart because the magic that kept their husbands at their side have gone away, and the men are realizing that they have been under the spell for X number of years. It's really fantastic and really fascinating, and was far and above my favorite part of this book. It was so good. I could read a million books set in this world. The character of Fetch Phillips himself was another sort of part that I was a little bit dubious about, because I was reminded a little bit in the sort of description of this book of the Dresden Files, and I absolutely hate the Dresden Files, mostly because I hate Harry Dresden. He's just a misogynistic, just absolute dickhead, and I hate him. I can't stand him. I read 3 of those books and was like, why am I doing this to myself? I have a lot of feelings about the Dresden Files, so I was a little bit nervous about this. However, Fetch Phillips was everything I wanted Harry Dresden to be, and I absolutely adored him. So, fun fact, I happen to be a huge fan of classic films, and I love noir, and you can really tell that Luke Arnold also loves and appreciates noir. He does an amazing job of creating a fantasy noir detective, from the mannerisms down to, his actions, to his hard drinking, to his past. Everything feels so incredibly perfect for that type of character. However, he does update him in a lot of ways. Updates some of the sort of darker sides of noir detectives. A lot of the sexism is not there. You can tell he really cares about the people that he's working for, even though he doesn't care about much in this world. He was a really great character. The only kind of places where I had some issues with this book were there were a lot of really long flashbacks, and while that background was really important and was really interesting as well, it broke up the story quite a lot and for a long time. I think that maybe it could have been worked on a little bit better, and there were some sort of bits about the plot that I don't want to spoil that I didn't love as much as well, but I really enjoyed this. I had so much fun reading it, and I will definitely be continuing on with the series. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I have is Wilder Girls by Rory Powers. This was a very much talked about book when it came out. Some people really loved it, some people really did not love it for a number of very legit reasons, and I was fully expecting to really adore it. I had heard that it was a YA feminist retelling or take on Lord of the Flies, and it featured lots and lots of body horror. So I was super excited for this. I had never read anything quite like this, especially in YA. I had very high expectations and I ended up not enjoying it, unfortunately. So this book follows two perspectives. We have Hetty and we have Byatt, and the two of them are best friends, and they were students at this school on this island off the coast of Maine. And a year and a half before the book starts, there's some kind of mysterious disease, mysterious illness that begins to transform the girls and the sort of creatures and wildlife and plant life on this island. Basically, everything goes full annihilation, and it's really awful. So you have Hetty's eye has fused shut, and something is kind of like, this is gross, I'm sorry, but she can feel like something moving underneath. There's a girl who's grown gills. There's a girl who's grown like a second bony spine down her back. One's hand has transformed into this sort of almost lizard-like silver scaly claw thing. Basically everyone has transformed in some kind of horrible way. The island has been quarantined and the Navy is basically sending them supplies and trying to figure out how to cure them of this disease. So that's all before the book starts. When the book does begin, it's a year and a half in, and they're just kind of living their life. They're just doing their thing. So it's Hetty and Byatt and their friend Riley? But their friend. And yeah, they're just kind of doing their thing, and I mean, like, stuff happens toward the end, and kind of like there's a plot, I think. But this book is basically just a snapshot of their life on this island doing nothing. There's no classes anymore. Most of the students and the teachers have died. It picks up towards the end and like stuff begins to happen, but there's something about this book that made it feel pointless. It didn't feel like there was a purpose for this book at all, which is really a shame, because I think that she had the foundations of an incredible story of survival and the things you have to do to survive, and, you know, the bonds of friendship and how those can be tested, all of this. And I don't think she quite went there. She went there with some of them, but not enough, and not with all of these things. And I think that because of that, this book really fell flat. You don't really get to know the characters at all, even though you are being told the story from their point of view, primarily through Hetty's point of view. I don't know anything about them. It's such a shallow characterization, even though it's literally the first person. And I don't really understand how that happens, you know? I really wish that she fleshed out the characters a little bit more, because if you're not going to have as much of a plot, it would be really awesome to have it be a super, super character-driven book, but I don't think that's what we got. I enjoyed the fact that there was body horror in this book. It's not something that I normally like, and I was a little bit wary of it going in, but it almost felt like there was no point to it. It felt like it was there kind of for shock value, and I'm sure that's not what she intended, but to me it didn't feel like it added anything to the story, because you could just have this group of, I don't know, 40 some odd girls and a couple of adults stuck on this island with no disease, no illness, nothing, and I feel like a lot of this would have played out in the same way. So it didn't feel like that was adding anything to the story, and I feel like it was the big selling point of the story. I just finished this yesterday, and I don't really rate books immediately after reading them. I try to let them settle in a little bit. This is probably going to be a 1.5 to 2 star read for me. I was hugely disappointed. It should have been incredible, and it just wasn't. And I have one more book to talk about, and I'm including it here because although I haven't finished it, I still have like 8 hours of January left. I am planning to finish this book today. This is The Hand on the Wall by Maureen Johnson. It is the final book in the Truly Devious series. I have like 3 hours of the audiobook left, so I'm going to go ahead and include it here. I have a funny relationship with the series because I thought the first book was alright. I liked the second book better, but I can't remember a single fucking thing that happened in that book except for like one plot point, and that's it. but I swear I remember I liked it. It's just completely gone from my head, and I am enjoying this second one, or this third one. I think the thing that is keeping my interest in the story alive is the historical murder. So basically, if you haven't read these books, they're YA crime series, and we follow a character named Stevie, who's a true crime aficionado, attending this sort of very specialized school called Ellingham Academy, where in the 1930s the founder's wife and daughter were kidnapped. The wife was murdered, the daughter's body never was found. And then in the present, we have Stevie, who is gonna solve this incredibly notorious, incredibly famous case, and then things begin to happen in the present, and a body turns up as well. It's my interest in the historical case that's keeping my desire to read this series alive. I feel like this could have been a duology. I don't think that we need 3 books for this story. I think that a lot of the present story could be cut out, and like, if you've read this, you'll know what I'm talking about, hopefully. Why do we have a character like David? David is the love interest, and he's just like, he's like my perfect example of a shitty YA love interest. He's fucking awful. He's terrible. And there's a lot of spoilery things that I don't want to go into in this. We can talk about it on DM or something if you like. But like, he's awful to her. He's horrible to her. He's a nasty, nasty little shit. And I hate the fact that he is probably going to continue to be the love interest in this story. I think that we should have better expectations for love interests in YA books, because for the most part, they suck. They really, really do. Male YA heroes suck. That is going to be my blanket statement that I'm making for the day. It's so infuriating because you have these awesome girls. I've really grown to like Stevie a lot. I didn't love her in the first book, but she's really growing on me. And she deserves someone so much better. She deserves someone who's going to understand her, who gets her and supports her. And David is not that. And I'm like, I'm pissed. I don't know what I'm going to rate this book yet. Probably in the 3 to 4 star range, depending on how it ends. I'll post a little thingy here, let you know what my rating is. But yeah, no, there's so many places in which the series could have gone right for me, and I think that it's just not quite there, which is really unfortunate. I would love something like this in YA in the future that sort of draws inspiration from Truly Devious but is better. So those are the books that I read or DNF'd in the month of January. I had a really good reading month, and I'm hoping to have a really good reading month next month. I will link my February TBR so you can go ahead and check that out. It's quite extensive. I'm hopefully gonna read a lot in February, fingers crossed, because I got a lot on the list. I would love to know in the comments below if you have read any of these books or if they are in your TBR. Let me know what you thought. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.